I've been working on the Opel for so long now that I needed to do something else. It didn't take much for me to lose my mojo. The pigsty was the first thing that came to mind, and so I started building it. Its role model is one that's about 500 meters away from where I live, but that one is used for sheep. I didn't want to build an exact replica of that sty because allowing a view inside was more important. On New Year I collected some rocket stakes. That's the cheapest way to get nice wooden beams for modeling. I found them in 3 sizes. The 2 thinner ones are made from balsa and the thickest one is made from spruce. I kept it for the farmhouse and decided to use the other 2 for the pigsty. Since I never make any drawings, you'll be able to follow the construction step by step now. There'll be a rear wall, a middle wall and a porch. The 2 parts of the roof will have different heights. For the wall I used McDonald's coffee stirrers. I cut 11 pieces of 37mm and 2 pieces of 35mm for the vertical boards. The wall will be 40mm high. Then I cut 6 pieces of 68mm for the horizontal boards. Including the beams, the wall will be 80mm wide. The last parts I needed were 4 short pieces of 1mm copper wire. Here you can see the first step of the assembly and the result after the PVA glue had cured. I wasn't really precise when I cut the stirrers to length, and so there was a little bit of sanding to do before the following step. Then the top and bottom strips were glued into place. While I sanded the bottom part flush with the rest, I left the top part as it was. I like it very much because it's uneven and looks like old worn wood. There are 2 channels for the pieces of copper wire on either side. Before inserting the wire, I glued the diagonal boards into place. Making these boards is quite simple. You take a coffee stirrer and hold it in position. Then you draw lines on the diagonal board that are following the vertical and horizontal parts underneath. I used my razor saw to cut off the wood along the lines. Later I used a sprue cutter for all cutting of the stirrers. That works much faster and better. After cleaning up the edges, you push the diagonal board's new end into one corner of the wall. Then you draw the lines for the opposite corner and repeat cutting and cleaning up. You should have a quite precise result now. The first diagonal board was then used as template for the second one. In this case, precision wasn't too important because in my imagination the farmer didn't call a carpenter to build the pigsty. He and his family did the job. Hey, that's what farmers usually do. Then I added marks for the holes I wanted to drill for the bolts. Time to insert the copper wire. I used CA glue for the job. I cut off the axes. Only 2mm were needed because these are just locators for the beams. I marked the correct positions on the beams and drilled the matching holes. Then the beams and the rear wall were glued together. Next, the top crossbar was attached. That completed the second major step of the assembly. Now all holes had to be drilled and bolts to be inserted. That was the most boring thing about it. During the build of the pigsty I used different materials for representing the bolts. I had 2 long pieces of stretched sprue left. They were used first. I cut off the pieces about 1/2 millimeter above the wood. Here I cut off the sprue flush. I can't remember why I did it, but of course I had to do it on all walls now. I drilled the whole way through, but glued only short pieces of sprue in from both sides. Here I put one piece in too far to insert another one from this side, but it didn't matter. All bolts were centered flush on the inside of the bottom boards. There'll be a wooden floor and the bolt's ends might be in the way. The middle wall closes the partition for the pigs. That's also the trough that'll be accessible from both sides. The trough will be divided lengthwise in two halves with pieces of 1mm copper wire. On the actual trough this is done with steel tubes. For the wire I had to drill holes into the balsa beams. Here you can see how I marked the positions for the holes and the tools I used to drill them. The bottom of the trough was glued onto the bottom beam. Then I drilled through the board from the underside of the beam. The holes aren't exactly in the center of the board, but that doesn't matter because there'll be food for the pigs in the trough. You won't see these imperfections when the style is completed, painted and weathered. Here you can also see the side parts for the trough. I used short pieces of 1mm copper wire as locators again. I glued the two vertical beams and the bottom beam together. The trough side parts and the upper beam fall out. Here I made a little mistake because I glued the upper beam into place the wrong way around. The holes in both beams weren't in the correct positions anymore. I should have marked the beam, but as you'll see it isn't too bad. Time to insert the first piece of copper wire. Not bad at all. I cut the copper wire to length and straightened it with a wooden ruler. The left and the right piece are shorter because of the locators. All wire put into place. I like it the way it is. To me it looks real, as if the farmer didn't do a hell of a job. Here are the board that goes on top of the upper beam and the two last pieces for the trough. And that's what the completed trough looks like. I didn't glue the wire. It can't go anywhere, so I would have wasted the glue.
Musik betrübt am Bahnhof stehen, wo ich träumen kann. Heute endlich kommst du an. Annabell, ach bitte komm doch schnell.
I glued a top cross board onto either side of the vertical beams. The roofs will sit on those boards. Short pieces of steel wire were used to represent the bolts that hold upper and lower beam in place. Here you see both walls. I like how they turned out. I already explained how I built the rear wall. The only difference between them is the size. The sidewall is only 3 centimeters high but 8.5 centimeters wide.
Heute endlich kommst du an. Annabell, ach bitte komm doch schnell, so schrei dich täglich. Mach mein Leben sonnenhell, geliebte Annabell.
Du hast die schönste Nase, du hast den schönsten Mund. Doch das ist zur Ekstase noch lange nicht für mich der Grund. Auch muss ich anerkennen, dein Grübchen unterm Kinn. Ich könnt noch vieles nennen, worin verliebt ich bin. Doch ich bin jetzt ganz ehrlich und erklär, das wäre alles nicht.
And here we have some dry fitting with all the walls I had finished at that point.
In deine Sommersprossen, die kleinen und die großen, sind meine Frau. Ich schau unverdrossen auf deine Sommersprossen, die kleinen und die großen, zu jeder Zeit.
The right wall contains the door. It'll be 32 millimeters wide and 29 millimeters high. As you can see, I glued one vertical board as frame to both sides of the door. Then I glued a second board to the board on the left-hand side of the door. That is necessary for the handle.
Zur Leopardin hin, Doch macht das im Dunkel, sonst merkt's vielleicht die Tigerin und sieht da ihre Duft.
This small section of the wall goes on the left-hand side next to the trough.
Sein Herz beginnt zu hupfen und ruft ganz entzückt. Es ist ja zwar gesprungen wie gehupft, doch lange nicht gestreift, so wie gedupft. Ich bin ganz verschossen in deine Sommersprossen.
Here you can see the two parts on the bottom board.
Ich schau verdrossen.
I added the diagonal boards to the door and marked the positions for the bolts. One bolt will be inserted from the rear side because the handle sits in its way from the front.
Ein neuer Sprössling sein, hab ins Herz geschlossen. Nur deine Sommersprossen, die kleinen und die großen, sind meine Freund. Doch eines Tages, da kam sie an.
Then the empty space was filled with the third part of the wall. It was built the same way as the previous walls. I removed some wood from the vertical boards of door and wall where they meet with a small square file. Then I glued pieces of 0.4 mm styrene sheet into place. These are parts of the door hinges. After that I glued the left and the right section of the wall onto the bottom board. I secured them with pieces of the same 0.6 mm copper wire I used as bolts. Then all bolts were added.
Ich sah unverdrossen auf deine Sommersprossen, die kleinen und die großen.
The door fits properly.
Zu jeder Zeit.
Before I moved on with the door, I did some dry fitting with what I had built so far. Now it was time to glue all bolts and the door handle into place. The handle was made from 1 mm copper wire. Next to the hinges, a lock is an important part of a door. I wanted to build a simple lock and I used a short piece of this nail. The nail's head was sanded down a bit because it was too thick to look good on the door. Here you see the part of the nail I used, and the two parts are made from 1 mm copper wire. All parts glued into place and locked shut. The lock will remain functional until the style will be glued onto the diode. And now for the most fiddly parts I had to build, the hinges. I used some evergreen 2.3 mm tube. You can stretch it like you do it with a piece of sprue, but it remains a tube. I needed 3 attempts to get the desired diameter. 2 short pieces of 0.3 mm copper wire were needed to complete the bottom parts of the hinges. I glued them to the right part of the wall, exactly in the center of the tiny gap between door and wall. Then I used 2 short pieces of stretched tube and 2 tiny pieces of 0.4 mm styrene sheet to build the other 2 parts of the hinges. I inserted a 0.2 mm drill bit in order to be able to hold the part while sanding the styrene into its proper shape. The 2 parts were put loosely into their counterparts, leaving a short distance between the tubes. Then the door was put into place. I had marked the correct positions of the hinges before. A little bit of liquid CA glue was used to glue these parts to the door. After I had removed the door, I used more CA glue to make sure that there be a strong bond between hinges and door. The hinges are functional now, but will be glued when the style is in its place on the diode. Let's start with the floor section that will be placed in front of the outer side of the trowel. A long and a short board were glued on top of each board with the cutaways. The short boards make way for the horizontal beams. The cutaways were needed to accommodate the long strips of wood that sit square to the short boards. Almost finished. And done. Again, I didn't do a precise job when I cut the boards. They were sanded to length later. More dry fitting with middle wall, floor and vertical beams that'll hold the roof section for this area of the sty. As you can see, I had to sand off a bit of both left and right boards. The vertical beams are thicker than the horizontal beam. After I had sanded the front edge of the floor, I added some damage, wear and tear to the edge. I used my hobby knife and a triangular file. The left and right edge received some damage too. Then the position for the bolts were marked and the floor was scrubbed with a wire brush. The brush removed the softer parts of the wood and enhanced the appearance of the wood grain. You'll see it much better after it's been painted and weathered. Drilling holes and inserting copper wire completed this sub-assembly. This is the support for the roof above the porch. For the base of the second section of the floor I used pieces of wooden spatulas. I glued 2 boards to either side. Then I added 2 cross members. The rest was just filling in the missing boards. I used some longer pieces that were left from previous steps here and there. Maybe the farmer would have done the same. Then some dry fitting with the walls followed. I marked where I wanted to put straw after the paint job. Lazy and tight as I am, I only wanted to put bolts to the area where there wouldn't be any or only little straw. I added wear and tear where the door would sit and I used the wire brush again. The sty needed a base. I made it from strips of wooden spatulas. The rear and the left sidewall were glued onto the base. Then the inner floor section followed. It fits almost perfectly. After the glue had cured, I added the right side wall. This sub-assembly will be painted separately, and the same goes for the middle wall, the outer floor section, and the supports for the porch's roof. I started with the larger section. First thing to do was to build a frame. Its size is 10.5 by 9 centimeters. For the beams I used long matches, the ones you use for the fireplace. Since they were only 9 centimeters long, I had to use 2 of them for one beam. Here are the parts I needed. I cut McDonald's coffee stirrers lengthwise and made strips of 90 millimeters. The matches were cut to 50 and 55 millimeters. I glued all strips to the frame. One wider strip was used where the 2 parts of the beams meet. Here you see the completed frame and some dry fitting. Next, I glued coffee stirrers vertically close to the left and right edges of the roof. They're actually locators and prevent the roof from moving sideways, but they'd be on the real side too. They'd be attached to the vertical beams. After that, I glued a second top crossbar to the middle vertical beams as a support for the roof. Of course, I drilled holes and inserted copper wire bolts. Then I glued one narrow strip each close to the upper and the lower edges of the roof. They'll serve as locators. The smaller roof section was built accordingly. And that's what the style looks like with both roofs. Time to make some corrugated sheet metal. This is stiff aluminum foil taken from the tray of a fish dish for the oven. After cleaning it thoroughly, it was flattened with a piece of wood. Then I cut it to pieces of 25 by 29 millimeters. Then the aluminum pieces were shaped with my press for corrugated sheet metal. The pieces were glued onto the wooden frames. What I found to be most complicated was to give them an uneven or unprofessional appearance. Gluing them into position precisely would have been easier, but I wanted it to look this way. Here are both parts of the roof. I added boards to the front of both and another one to the rear of the larger section. And here's the completed pigsty. I'm very happy with the way it turned out. The roofs will also be painted separately. I received 3 figure sets. Inbox reviews will follow. That's it for now.
Crazy pig, all I wanna do is a rock and roll jig down on the farm.